Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host. I'm together with Dr. Greg Miller, our host, and we are pleased to have with us Deb Laaser, our Director of Faithful and True. And we are here today to fulfill an ongoing request we've been getting from our clients to do a podcast based around full disclosure. And so many of you might know, last month we featured our full disclosure PDF product on our website as a free giveaway. It's normally a $4.95 purchase, still affordable. And it led to a lot of people looking into it and trying to wrap their heads around what is all involved with full disclosure. So Greg and Debbie are here to discuss full disclosure.
Well, great. We're glad that you're here, Deb.
Yeah, always glad to be.
I know that we get a lot of questions about this idea of full disclosure and what do I tell to people, specifically my spouse or my children or my community. And so when someone has been discovered and they're wanting to become truth tellers and to be honest, we believe it's important that they begin to be honest with the people in their lives. In fact, a phrase that I often use is people will say, who should I tell my story to? And the answer is always, who do you want to be loved by? Mm-hmm. Because we can only be loved to the extent that we are known. And we also know that this can be a pretty painful experience for a spouse to begin to get this information. And so what do you see as kind of the reason, the motivation, and why would we encourage someone to share some of this information with their spouse?
Well, I think foundationally, Greg, I'm aware, and it's true in our field, that we're all human beings who are very intuitive. And what that means that at some level, whether we're given information or not, because we're living close to someone in the same environment, our bodies do pick up information about what's going on. And that intuitive place, or we call it our gut feeling, or we have a red flag about something, it creates some knowing inside of us. And when that doesn't match the knowing of what someone else is telling us or what we're living with, I believe it creates this huge tension between what's inside of us and what's outside of us. And that tension can create really a lot of symptoms in our bodies, including physical symptoms of illness, but even emotionally, it creates, I think, a feeling of being crazy. Like I think this is happening, but someone else is telling me it's not happening, so maybe I'm just going crazy.
Right.
And that comes up a lot when I work with wives in the early stages of recovery, is that fear that they really are going crazy. And when we feel like we're going crazy, we start acting like we're going crazy, because I think our soul is so intent on us living in truth. We know that biblically. The truth sets us free. The truth is what we need to live in peace. When we don't have truth, I believe there's everything about us that feels stirred up and out of sync. So I think one of the greatest things we do for anyone is to speak the truth. And of course, in our field of sex addiction, that becomes very important, as there have been secrets or lying or hiding over the years. And someone else who's been opposite of that has lived with that. It can create a lot of symptoms and craziness for them.
Right. One of the things, kind of the language I like, is that we intuitively know that something is off.
Yeah.
We may not know what is off, but something is telling us that, like you said, reality and what's going on don't seem to match. And I often say to the men, one of the best gifts that you can give your wife is the gift of truth. And I've heard you say it, and I just love the phrase that truth may be hurtful and it is never harmful. And in fact, it's the lying, it's the deception, that's what is creating the harm. And yet the truth, when it's given, and it's given in a kind and generous way. We're going to talk more specifically about some of the factors that are helpful in a full disclosure. But one of them is that it's done out of an act of love and service, not in a way of being mean or intentionally hurting someone. So even the way that the truth is told is important in this process.
I believe so. And, there's some issues with, say, the 12-step organizations, which, by the way, we totally advocate. But in there, when they encourage someone to tell the truth to someone else, there is this part of one of those steps that says, unless it would do injury to the other person. And that can be interpreted in a lot of ways. Injury is like, wow, if they're really sad or crying or distraught or they can't sleep anymore, they've gotten depressed over this, that would be creating injury to someone. And I understand that it feels bad, and it feels like I'm hurting another person more so than they already are. Except I totally agree with what you're saying. The harm of allowing someone not to live in truth is much greater, much greater.
Yeah, okay, so in a little bit we're going to talk about this idea of telling the truth to our children, to our friends, our community. But let's just take a moment and talk specifically for couples, for guys who are married. They have gone through some sort of explosion or exposure. Their wife knows some things. She doesn't know everything. And we're going to be encouraging him to provide the information through a full disclosure. So in those situations, what do you believe is needed in order for the couple to be able to move through that well?
Well, this is always the $1,000,000 question, so
that was a big one.
Yeah,
that was a big one. I think basically we want her to know anything that would affect her life so that, again, she's not able to live in truth. So it's going to involve a lot of things like how much and what activities they were doing that they were hiding, and not just, oh gosh, I struggled with porn for the last 10 years. But many other things about when it happened and where it happened and what were they telling their wife so that they could find time to do what they were doing, or how much money was spent that might have actually been family money, and that was also a secretive part of what was going on. A wife needs to know if there were certain places that were visited, say with affair partners or prostitutes or so forth, that she might be frequenting herself, or they might, in terms of it being a favorite restaurant of theirs or a favorite place to vacation or a hotel or a cabin up north. We hear that a lot here in Minnesota.
right.
When we don't share information about places that have been part of that secret life, what happens if you revisit that as a couple is there is an energy, again, that shows up that can be felt. And I know some people may not believe that. And again, it's kind of what we believe about how the Spirit continues to show up inside of us to know there's something off,
right.
like you say. She needs to know any people that have been involved in his life that may, in fact, have crossed her life somehow. Are there employees he works with that she knows about or has entertained in their home, or are there friends that's often a case. There are friendships that are involved, or even family members or neighbors or someone that she would know if she ran into them. And I never want a wife to be the only person who doesn't know a story if, in fact, they ever merged, the
right.
three of them or however many of them come together. So there's a lot of information that's really important for her to know, to fill in. I always say, like these puzzle pieces.
Right.
She's building this big jigsaw puzzle. There have been a ton of pieces pulled out. We don't really know what that picture looks like. And every time she gets one of these pieces, she's able to fully complete what that looks like.
Yeah, I use the image. It's kind of like many times the wife has all these pieces to the puzzle, but she doesn't know the big picture. Mm-hmm. And when a husband is willing to do full disclosure, it's like giving her the cover to the box. And now she can see the big picture and how these individual pieces can fit into it.
Yes.
And those places, it kind of like you said, validates their intuition that something was going on then or mm-hmm. something was off then, and they just weren't aware of what that might be. Mm-hmm. One of the ways that I say to husbands is, you want her to have the information that she needs so that she has a security that she has enough. Mm-hmm. And we want her to be working with some professional help, because what's true is there may be some details that the wife feels like she needs, but really in the long term won't be helpful. Mm-hmm. But on her own, she may not be able to discover that. But in safe community with trained professionals, she may be able to get clarity about what will be helpful and what won't be helpful in the details.
I think that's a very good point to talk about now, Greg, because for the majority of wives who first discover their husband's acting out history, it's very unusual for them not to have a belief that there has been something wrong with them. Mm-hmm. They continually believe, I haven't been enough, or I'm not the right character, I'm not sexual enough, I'm not tall enough, I'm not pretty enough, my body doesn't look the way it needs to be, and that's why he's involved in these activities. Of course, our recovery journey is one about reframing beliefs that aren't true. And it's very hard for a wife to believe in the early stages of recovery that there isn't something about her. So understandably, her questions, if left to her to know what she wants to know, might be way too much about some of those physical aspects of the pornography he's watching, or the people he's been with, or the prostitutes he's been visiting, because she has a need to compare that to see what was wrong with her. What I remind wives is we want to be careful about what we pour into her brain as well, because she will remember these things. And just as we're helping him to focus on healthier things, he has also all these experiences and memories from his own life experiences that are difficult to get out of his brain. And we don't want to do the same thing to her, pour in all of these questions that really are not, in essence, about helping her live with reality. So as you say, the best way to deal with that is to have her check those out, those kinds of questions, with a professional and other women who have been in full disclosure processes, because oftentimes they will say, I absolutely insisted on knowing this about that, or sexual positions, or body parts, or whatever it was, and today I really wish I had never asked that. So only those who are more experienced, I think, can sometimes at least slow her down from what she's wanting to know, and hopefully helping her understand why she needs to know that question rather than others that are going to be more helpful to her process.
Well, and I love that first kind of standard of, does this question lead to greater comparison or to greater understanding? Mm-hmm. And if a spouse can begin to get clear about what are those questions that she may want to ask that will leave her in that place of comparison versus simply understanding. And one of the things that, again, this idea that this information will be painful, and ultimately what we're wanting is there to be a sense of safety for the coupleship. And what's also true is I often tell men that information cannot lead to safety. Because what happens is, if I'm given information and I still don't feel safe, then I can begin to think, I just need more information. And eventually that can cause me not only not to be safe, but to feel unsafe. But what information can do is to give us an understanding that then we can determine how to create safety for ourselves. Mm-hmm. Now that I have this information, what do I need to do so that I can be safe, either in this relationship or in some other context?
And actually, that leads to a really important part about how we do disclosures, which is he prepares and offers information to her. And there's such a difference between how you get your information if you're interested in creating safety and building trust. And what we know is offering information is what helps build trust and ultimately safety for the future, because it is initiating what is true. Always. Initiating, here's how I'm feeling, here's how I'm thinking, here's what I'm tempted to do, here's what I'm choosing to do. Initiating all of those parts about who you are is what helps another person build trust in who you are as a person. Many disclosures involve wives making lists upon lists of all their questions and a husband simply agreeing to answer questions. We know that doesn't work because for a wife who gets to make questions, there are never going to be enough questions. And if she asked 100, then how does she know she asked the right ones or enough of them? And so she'll continue to think of questions and more questions. And therefore, we need to change how this happens so that it is an offering and it's initiated by the person that created the hurt.
Yeah. When I'm working with the men at the workshop, and we do talk about full disclosure there, one of the things I want to communicate is sometimes in their mindset is they are doing this for their wives. Mm-hmm. And yet the reality is they're doing it for themselves and for the coupleship, because very much like what you said, if their wife only knows things because she's asked questions, then that puts her into the role of being this interrogator. And I have heard men say, you can ask me anything and I will be honest. And that comes from a sincere place. It's just that that's not going to build that sense of safety and trust. Mm-hmm. So by offering information, it's not about her asking questions. The other piece is a lot of times wives know things because they found that information, they found that receipt, or they saw the history. And without realizing it, the wife is starting to become a detective, and that changes the dynamic of the relationship. And where a wife is a detective or an interrogator, it's going to limit their intimacy. But in a place where a husband is willing to say, I'm bringing this information to you. You don't have to ask questions. You don't have to try to search out my history. I'm going to be honest with you. Then that begins to change the dynamic of how they're able to relate to each other.
Right. And I think it is true that if a wife has found herself to be a detective, and most wives I know don't like being in that place, because as you said, it really destroys the partnership of a coupleship. It kind of turns her into an investigator or a parent or, a spouse in that regard, trying to find out what the little guy has done,
Right.
and it doesn't lead to partnering and intimacy. And it's a reminder to me that she hasn't had full disclosure. And I simply tell her that. I said, let's abandon the unhealthy way of trying to get this information, and let's go after setting up full disclosure, which I think you will find gives you what you need, so you don't need to be in that place when your soul really does need information. So it's not that what you're after is not what you need.
Right.
It's just how you're going after it that's not going to be helpful.
Deb, is it common when the husband goes through full disclosure with his wife, is that a new source of trauma for the wife, his information that he's sharing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it can be somewhat trauma, but we always say we don't expect our full disclosures to be bombshells.
Okay.
In other words, generally speaking, information about what has happened has come out in streaks in what I call the installment plan. Generally, when there's been discovery of an addiction, there is information that's coming out there. There's probably information that's come out from her detective work or falling into information, and then she's obviously been asking some questions, which probably he's tried to answer. So it has been coming out, and we don't want full disclosure to be bombshell information,
right,
to answer your question. And frankly, I've really almost never found it to be so, although we never know what piece of information could be the piece that is really disturbing to a wife.
Right.
I mean, to me, it might seem like kind of a small thing, but to her, it represents something else that really starts to feel very traumatic.
A lot of times when I'm working with a man to do his full disclosure, I'll kind of ask, is there anything that you are aware of that you think your wife is going to have a strong reaction to? And what I've experienced is sometimes their intuition is right, that this detail is significant and very painful for their spouse to hear. Other times they were caught off guard. They didn't realize that detail was something that was specific, that was painful for them. But
right,
as you understand the story, then you begin to recognize why that detail was very difficult for the spouse to hear.
Mm-hmm. I think it's good to remember too, Randy, in terms of your question, that we're not trying to avoid trauma. We don't necessarily want to deliver it if we don't have to. However, because we know that we can recover from traumatic situations, and we can actually grow from them. But we want to be mindful of what someone needs, knowing that they could go into something that's going to be hard. It's kind of like surgery. When we go in for surgery, we know we're going to want some support, and we want someone there with us when we get home for a few days because we may not be feeling well. The same thing for this kind of procedure is it can be hard, and for some it can be traumatic. And we do our best so that it doesn't become bombshell trauma.
Right.
And we can't always direct that.
Yeah, and a lot of times part of the questions that we're going to be asking around preparing for a full disclosure is who in your life can you include? Mm-hmm. So, who in your community can you connect to before this? Who can you talk to afterwards? And then in a full disclosure, we want it done with professional support so that even in the midst of hearing the information, the couple is not alone. So, we can't completely minimize the pain, and that wouldn't even be our goal. We want to create a support vessel that makes it possible for someone to navigate the pain and not be consumed by it. When I'm working, with a couple, or I'm talking to the guys about full disclosure, to me there are two principles that are very important. The first is for the man. He is committed to being completely open and honest and thorough with everything he remembers. And so he's going to work and be intentional to remember and to share. And for the wife, it's that she is open to being open, and she gets as many opens as she needs to the possibility that her husband might be telling the truth. Because in that moment of full disclosure, it's not about immediately trusting, because that may take some time to return, but it's just enough openness to this is the story, and I'm going to consider that this is the truth of the story.
And you're right, Greg, that can be difficult for wives who now have been exposed to the truth that they've been lied to for many years. Many have been, their whole marriage, 20, 30, 40 years even. And so, they often say to me, well, why would I believe what he's saying to me into full disclosure? I think one of the things that we are mindful of is making sure people are prepared for full disclosure, meaning they're in the right mindset, heart set,
right,
to do full disclosure. It's why, in our center anyway, I strongly encourage the process of a man going through our 3-day men's workshop, Men of Valor workshop first, because I typically find that once they have gone through that, I think their attitude often changes from, well, gosh, I've got to tell the truth now, kind of begrudgingly perhaps, and hesitantly to, I want to be a truth teller. And that is a huge difference in terms of how you hear that from someone. And I often tell a wife to listen for his heart change when he's talking this time, perhaps, compared to previous conversations they've had about questions or answers to questions. Because this heart change and this desire for him to be really changed from the inside out is going to show up in full disclosure for a man who says, I know I may be just blowing up my life here, saying what I'm going to say, and I know that this is the path God wants me on, to be a truth teller, and he will help orchestrate what's next. My only job is to do the next right thing. So that's where we start in our disclosures.
And I also, again, as we understand, for the men, one of the things that can be difficult is, for most of their life, they were lying and people trusted them. Now they're finally telling the truth, and it's like nobody believes them. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I want the men to understand is you can own that you created the situation. So just because you're finally being truthful doesn't mean that everybody's going to suddenly start to believe you. But what we hope is that in time, as you continue to live as a trustworthy person, eventually the belief will come. I often tell the guys, you cannot get anybody to trust you. All you can do is be trustworthy, and then people get to decide what they're going to do with that.
Exactly.
Well, in the few minutes that we have left, we're going to talk more about this in a follow-up podcast, but let's just talk broadly about, what about other people in my life, my kids, my community? How do I know who to share and how much to share with in those situations?
Well, we always say that it's best, if possible, to start with your marital relationship or committed relationship. Start with the one where ideally you are the closest, you want to be the most vulnerable, you're building emotional intimacy. And in that relationship, you're going to do the most complete full disclosure of telling all of the truth. From there, we have these outer rings of circles of people that we care about and hope will love us, including our children and maybe family members, maybe parents, siblings, or so forth. And what we want to decide is exactly how much of what we totally shared in here we're going to share in this next circle of folks. And it doesn't mean that it has to be everything. I think that's where a lot of folks get, kind of stumble around with this, because a lot of them are black and white. I either tell everything or I tell them nothing.
Right.
And the truth is we have a lot of choices in there between those two extremes. And I think it really relieves people to know, and even to think about, well, I guess that's kind of nice to know. I don't need to tell everything. And it can be even as general as, I've really struggled with some behaviors that I'm not proud of, and I'm working on stopping that in my life, and, it's led to a lot of pain in my life, or whatever. It could be very general. Two, it could be more specific. Again, people who are closest to us, we generally say, are those we're going to want to share more with. Because the closer we get to someone, generally the more vulnerable we're willing to be. Deciding what we're going to say, I believe is also something that can be very helped with other professionals or other people who have gone through this process. I think sometimes we just don't think about what's going to be most helpful to share with our children and how to go about doing that sharing, when to do that. So to get the expertise of folks, it's one of the things we do here a fair amount, is to talk through every situation, because everyone is different. And so helping folks to decide what's going to feel right for them so that they feel good about that is a process. And then there's that outer circle of our friends, perhaps, that we spend a lot of time with, maybe a pastor in the church who's come to know us well, neighbors who know us. Again, our decision is foundationally based on who do I want to be close to in my life? Who do I care about, and who do I care that, as you said, care about me and love me? And if we do want to care about people and let them care about us, then we're going to want to be truthful with them. I think we are all working on a core belief inside of us. If you really knew me,
Right.
the good and the bad, would you still be here caring and loving me? And when we tell the truth, that's the only way we can really find out about that. Because if all we ever show anybody is the best part of who we are, we're never really sure what that response is going to be. So we know that folks that move along in recovery and do well are ones that make a decision to not hide with their story in their basement, in their house,
Right.
whatever, but to choose people who really are important parts of their life and to risk telling them the truth. And I mean, I have rarely seen the response be that someone walks out of your life when you tell them the truth about something you've struggled with.
Right.
Rarely seen that happen.
Well, one of the key factors to this is this idea of vulnerability. And vulnerability is when we are exposed, and in that exposure we can either be hurt or healed. And without vulnerability, there is no healing. And so we're going to encourage people to be wise and to be safe and also to be known.
And we hope that our listeners and viewers have been encouraged today by this podcast. We want to thank Debbie for joining us, and Greg, as always. I can see so clearly why our listeners have wanted this subject to be discussed. It's very encouraging and enlightening. If you enjoyed today's podcast, we invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel for Faithful and True. We'd also like to have you give this video a thumbs up. If you're listening to the audio version of this podcast, you have the opportunity to leave reviews or comments, and we welcome all of those. Your input is important to us. So we encourage you to also, if you're listening to this message and you're realizing that there is a problem that you're struggling with, we're here for you. This is what we do. And so I invite you to look into the Men of Valor 3-day intensive workshop that Greg referenced earlier. We do it every month. And because of COVID-19, we've been doing it virtually with using the professional level of Zoom video technology. And we have been thrilled with the very positive response and acceptance of that format. So take a look into that. That is on our website at faithfulandtrue.com. Click on workshops and then click on the Men of Valor workshop, where Greg and Chris Hardesty, one of our counselors, will answer the most frequently asked questions that men often have about the workshop. And there's also a earlier podcast with Dr. Rick Underwood, who did his entire master's dissertation on the effectiveness of our workshops. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by his findings. So until we join you again next week, we hope that the coming week is going to be a week for you personally that's filled with many blessings and great vision.